The clatter of silverware and muted conversations filled the restaurant, a quiet hum of normalcy that contrasted sharply with the tension at our table. I sat rigidly, my hands folded tightly on my lap, watching my father, David, push a thick white envelope across the table toward me with 2 fingers, as if it was something dirty he wanted to be rid of. Inside, I already knew, was another demand dressed up as an obligation, an expectation that I would once again be the family's emergency fund. My stomach twisted even before I touched it. "Open it," he said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable sharpness. Beside him, Lily, my younger sister, shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes darting between us. I picked up the envelope slowly, the paper cool against my fingertips. Sliding out the document inside, my breath caught when I saw the words printed at the top: hospital bill, balance due, $48,362.14. I closed the envelope and placed it back on the table without a word. "You can cover it," Dad said, as casually as if he were asking me to pass the salt. "You make more than enough. It's your sister." Across the table, Lily said nothing. She didn't meet my eyes. I had done this dance before, paid for her tuition, her car, even bailed her out when she crashed it 2 years ago. Each time, there was an unspoken rule: Emma will fix it. Emma will pay. But this time, something inside me refused. Maybe it was the medical debt I was still paying off from my own surgery. Maybe it was the exhaustion that came from being treated like a walking ATM. Or maybe it was the sudden, crystal-clear realization that they would never stop as long as I kept saying yes. "I'm not paying it," I said, my voice steady, almost frighteningly calm. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the entire room had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. Dad's face flushed red. His hands, calloused from years of manual labor, curled into fists on the table. "What do you mean you're not paying it?" he growled. "I mean," I said, keeping my voice level, "I'm not responsible for Lily's bills. I didn't put her in that hospital." "You selfish little," he started, his voice rising. Other diners turned to look. A waiter paused a few steps away, uncertain whether to intervene. "You're her sister," Dad barked. "Family takes care of family." I held his gaze. "Family doesn't bleed you dry and call it love." That was when it happened. Without warning, he lunged across the table, his chair scraping violently against the tile floor. His hand shot out, grabbing the collar of my blouse, yanking me forward so fast my chair tipped onto 2 legs. Gasps rippled through the restaurant. Someone shouted. I heard the crash of plates breaking somewhere behind me. For a second, time froze. I saw everything: the disbelief in the waiter's eyes, the horrified expressions of strangers, the white-hot fury distorting my father's face. And then I moved. I stood abruptly, breaking his grip. My chair clattered to the floor behind me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply stepped back, out of reach, and stared at him with a coldness I didn't know I possessed. "I said no," I repeated. Dad's chest heaved. His fists opened and closed spasmodically. Lily finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Please, Emma," she whispered, tears welling up. "I need your help." For years, that would have been enough. Her tears would have unlocked my wallet like a magic spell. But not anymore. "You should have thought about that before," I said, turning to leave. "You walk away now, you're no daughter of mine." Dad roared after me, loud enough that conversations at nearby tables stopped completely. I paused, my back to him. I could feel the heat of everyone's eyes boring into me, the unspoken judgment, the whispered speculations. Slowly, I turned my head over my shoulder and met his gaze one last time. "You made that decision a long time ago," I said quietly. Then I walked out of the restaurant without looking back. The cold night air slapped me in the face as I pushed through the door. My hands were shaking, not with fear, but with adrenaline, with the sheer overwhelming weight of the moment. I drew a deep, shuddering breath, the first real breath I'd taken all evening. Behind me, through the glass doors, I could see my father still standing there, frozen, people staring at him like he was something broken and dangerous. Lily sat at the table, her head in her hands. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt tired. Tired of being the only one expected to sacrifice, the only one blamed when I couldn't give enough. I walked to my car in the far end of the parking lot, my steps slow but steady. As I reached for the door handle, I realized my cheeks were wet. Silent tears had escaped without me noticing. I wasn't crying because I regretted what I'd done. I was crying because part of me still mourned the family I had always wished for, the family that would have protected me instead of using me, supported me instead of draining me dry. Sliding into the driver's seat, I wiped my face roughly with the sleeve of my jacket. I sat there for a long moment, staring out at the empty street beyond. This was the night everything changed. The night I stopped being their safety net. The night I chose myself. The night I realized that sometimes, family isn't who you're born to. It's who you choose to keep. And starting now, I was choosing me. In the days that followed, the silence from my family was deafening. No calls. No texts. Nothing. It was as if I had been erased, like some stain they were too disgusted to look at anymore. And yet, the void they left didn't ache the way I had once feared it would. It felt more like a deep, aching relief, a pressure that had been lifted after years of pretending that love and obligation were the same thing. I had braced myself for some sort of retaliation, but when the first text came, it was almost laughably predictable. It was from my Aunt Marjorie, a woman who had barely spoken to me outside of Christmas cards but now, apparently, felt the need to intervene. Family takes care of each other. Her message read, "You've let your father down. You've let all of us down." I stared at the words for a long moment before deleting the message without responding. The next day, a flood of similar messages came pouring in, from cousins, from distant relatives who knew nothing about my sacrifices, from old family friends who had only heard one side of the story. Each text and voicemail painted me with the same brush: selfish, heartless, cold. I could have explained. I could have written out a detailed ledger of every dollar I had handed over throughout the years, every late-night phone call I had answered, every vacation I had canceled because someone else needed money more. But I didn't. Because I realized, explaining myself to people who had already decided I was wrong would change nothing. Their minds were made up. And for once, I didn't care enough to try. Still, the attacks hurt more than I wanted to admit. On the third night, as I sat curled up on my battered sofa with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, I wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe I was heartless. Maybe I had become too hardened, too defensive, too selfish. But then I remembered the nights I had lain awake, wondering how I would afford my rent after bailing Lily out of yet another crisis. I remembered missing meals to stretch my paycheck. I remembered the bitter taste of resentment every time I handed over money and received nothing but entitlement in return. This wasn't heartlessness. This was survival. It had always been survival. The next few weeks unfolded like a slow-motion car crash. I heard, through mutual acquaintances, that Lily was struggling to manage her hospital bills. Without my financial support, the collections agencies had descended on her like vultures. Dad tried to step in, but his credit was already a disaster zone. The bank wouldn't even let him co-sign a loan for a used car, let alone a $48,000 medical debt. One afternoon, I received a letter forwarded from my old address, where I'd lived before my most recent move, a letter from a debt collection agency, demanding payment for Lily's hospital bills. They had somehow tied my name to the account, probably through some emergency contact form she had filled out without my consent. I felt the old panic rising, an automatic instinct to fix it, to protect her, to clean up the mess. My hands trembled slightly as I held the letter. The urge to cave in was so strong, so deeply ingrained, that I had to physically set the letter down and walk away. Instead of reacting, I contacted a lawyer. Within a few days, my lawyer had sent a cease and desist letter to the debt agency, formally stating that I was not financially responsible for Lily's obligations. The relief I felt after hanging up the phone was almost disorienting. It was the first time in my life that I had chosen to protect myself first. Of course, word of my betrayal traveled fast. Dad left a voicemail that evening, his voice thick with fury. "You could have fixed this, Emma. You could have stepped up. You're a disgrace. Don't bother showing your face around here again." There was a time when those words would have gutted me. But now, they only confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Their love was conditional. It always had been. If I was useful, I was loved. If I said no, I was discarded. And that wasn't love at all. What became my sanctuary? I buried myself in projects, in deadlines, in anything that reminded me that I was capable, valuable, not the failure my family wanted me to believe I was. Slowly, the gnawing guilt that had anchored itself in my chest began to fade. I even started sleeping better. No more 2 a.m. panic attacks over bounce checks. No more endless calculations of who needed what, and when, and how much I would have to sacrifice to make it happen. For the first time in years, my money was mine. And not just my money, my peace, my time, my future. One Saturday morning, as I sat on my tiny balcony sipping coffee and feeling the early spring sun on my face, I allowed myself to dream. Not dreams of being the savior of my family, not dreams of finally being accepted if I just did a little more, but dreams for myself. I wanted to travel, to finish the degree I had abandoned years ago, to adopt a dog, to buy a home that was mine and mine alone. Simple dreams, but they were mine. The barrage of guilt trips and manipulative messages eventually slowed to a trickle and then stopped altogether. It was as if my family had collectively decided that, since I was no longer useful, I no longer existed. And strangely, that suited me just fine. One evening, several months after the incident at the restaurant, I bumped into an old neighbor at the grocery store. She clucked sympathetically when she heard the news, how I had abandoned my family in their time of need. I simply smiled and shrugged. "Sometimes you have to choose yourself," I said. She blinked at me, startled by the calmness in my voice, and quickly changed the subject. I knew what people thought. I knew the stories that had been spun about me in whispered conversations and judgmental glances. But they didn't know the full story. They didn't know the years of sacrifice, the endless taking, the bone-deep weariness of being valued only for what I could give. And even if they had known, it wouldn't have mattered. I no longer needed their understanding or their approval. Freedom, I realized, wasn't just about financial independence. It was about emotional independence too. It was about reclaiming my own narrative, refusing to let other people's guilt and anger dictate how I live my life. It was about knowing that saying no didn't make me cruel. It made me strong. It made me survive. One quiet night, as I sat at my kitchen table sorting through old papers, I came across a worn photograph. Me, Lily, and Dad at a carnival when I was about 10. In the photo, I was grinning, cotton candy in one hand, my other hand clutching Dad's. Lily, still a toddler, perched on his hip, reaching for my treat. I stared at the picture for a long time, sadness welling up. I missed that little girl, the one who had believed that family meant safety, and trust, and unconditional love. But I didn't miss the illusion. I gently slid the photo into a drawer and closed it. That chapter was over. And I was finally, blessedly, free to write a new one. The first real crack in their perfect facade came 2 months after I had walked away. It arrived not as a scream or a dramatic confrontation, but as a quiet notice slipped into my mailbox at my new apartment, a copy of a lien notice against my father's property. Apparently, David had tried to leverage what little equity he had left in the old family home to secure a loan to cover Lily's hospital bill. But with his poor credit history and an unstable income, the bank wasn't biting. The lien was a desperate attempt to stave off the growing mountain of debt, but it was only a temporary bandage on a bleeding wound. I sat there at the kitchen table, the notice spread out in front of me, sipping my coffee while a strange, hollow ache opened up inside my chest. There was no joy in seeing their downfall. Only a cold, detached acknowledgement that this was the natural consequence of years of decisions made on the assumption that I would always be there to bail them out. Without my income to siphon from, my father and Lily were exposed, vulnerable. They had built their stability on a foundation that was never theirs to begin with. Without me, it was only a matter of time before everything they had taken for granted collapsed. News traveled in dribs and drabs to the old neighborhood network. Mr. Jensen, the retired man who lived next door to my childhood home, ran into me at the supermarket one Saturday morning and, after a bit of awkward small talk, let it slip that my father's utilities had been cut off for non-payment. "Shame," he said, shaking his head. "After all he did for his family." I just smiled tightly and pushed my cart past him. The truth was, Dad hadn't done half as much for us as everyone liked to think. He had been the loud, blustering face of our family, but it was my mother, now long gone, who had kept us fed, kept the bills paid, kept the peace. Without her steady, invisible labor, the cracks had always been there. They just hadn't been visible until now. The next sign came when Lily called me. I didn't answer. Her name flashing on my screen was enough to make my stomach clench. She left a voicemail, her voice high and desperate. "Emma, please, I know you're angry, but I need your help. They're threatening to take Dad's house. I don't know what to do. Please, just call me back. Please." I sat there for a long time, phone in hand, before I deleted the message. There was nothing left to say. I had made my boundaries clear. I had chosen survival, chosen myself, and no amount of begging would change that now. Soon after, a mutual acquaintance forwarded me a link to a GoFundMe page Lily had started. The description was filled with half-truths and omissions, phrases like unexpected medical crisis and family hardship, without a single mention of the years of mismanagement and entitlement that had led them to this point. I stared at the page for a long moment, noting the pitifully low amount they had managed to raise, before clicking away. I wasn't surprised. Sympathy was a currency my family had never learned to truly earn. As the months passed, the unraveling accelerated. Dad's truck, the ancient Ford he had stubbornly clung to for years, was repossessed. Without reliable transportation, he lost his part-time construction job. Without that income, he fell behind on property taxes. Without my financial safety net, they had no backup plan, no cushion, no way to fake stability any longer. And through it all, they kept trying to find ways to reach me. First through guilt-laden texts, then angry emails, then, when those failed, through the community, church friends, old neighbors, even distant relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years. Each message carried the same underlying tone: "This is your fault." But it wasn't. Their downfall wasn't because I had walked away. It was because they had built their entire world on the assumption that I wouldn't. The final collapse came in a rush. I found out through a post on social media that the house had been foreclosed on. An auction notice, public and humiliating, listed the property for sale, along with a dry inventory of its assets. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, significant deferred maintenance. I wondered if Dad had even tried to fight it, or if, by then, he had finally realized the inevitability of it all. Part of me wanted to drive by the old house, to see it one last time before it disappeared into someone else's hands. I imagined standing there on the cracked sidewalk, looking up at the sagging roof, the peeling paint, the overgrown lawn. But I didn't go. There was nothing left there for me. I got the final piece of the story a few weeks later when Mrs. Patel, the woman who used to live 2 houses down, ran into me at a coffee shop. She sat down across from me without waiting for an invitation, her cup clinking against the table. "Did you hear?" she asked, eyes wide with morbid curiosity. "Your father moved in with Lily. Small apartment, not even 2 bedrooms. Tough situation." I nodded, non-committal. "They said they tried everything," she added meaningfully. I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl into the dark liquid. "They tried everything," I echoed softly. "Except accountability. Except humility. Except changing." When she realized I wasn't going to offer any juicy details or emotional outbursts, Mrs. Patel drifted away, disappointed. I sat there for a long time after she left, the sunlight streaming through the windows, warming my skin. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt completely and utterly at peace. Their collapse had nothing to do with hatred or revenge. It was simply the natural consequence of choices made and bills coming due. I hadn't destroyed them. I had simply stopped holding them up. Weeks later, I received one final attempt at contact, a letter, handwritten in my father's messy scrawl, no envelope, just folded and left taped to the door of my building. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a genuine appeal. It was a list of grievances, a bitter inventory of all the ways I had failed my family. Reading it, I realized something important. There would never be an apology. There would never be a moment of clarity, of recognition, of remorse. They would always see themselves as the victims and me as the villain. And that was fine, because I wasn't living for their approval anymore. I tucked the letter into a folder labeled Lessons Learned and slid it into the back of my closet, where I kept other relics from my old life, documents, photos, memories. Not to forget, but to remind myself how far I had come. Their world had crumbled without me, but mine had only just begun to rise. I had started therapy, working through the complicated knots of guilt and obligation that had tied me to people who only loved me for what I could give them. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since college. I adopted a dog, a scrappy little rescue named Max who adored me unconditionally, no strings attached. I began planning a trip overseas, something I had always dreamed of but had put off because there was always someone else's need, someone else's crisis, someone else's emergency. Not anymore. Every small act of self-love felt like a quiet rebellion against the life I had once lived. Every step forward was a reminder that survival wasn't just about escaping the fire. It was about learning how to live without constantly looking over your shoulder for the next spark. Sometimes survival meant letting things fall apart. Sometimes it meant watching the wreckage without rushing in to save anyone. Sometimes it meant accepting that some bridges needed to burn so that you could like your own way forward. As spring turned into summer, and the days grew longer and warmer, I found myself standing on my balcony one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Max lay at my feet, snoring softly, and in the distance, city lights began to flicker on one by one. I thought about Dad, about Lily, about the life I had left behind. And I smiled. Not because I was glad they had suffered, but because, for the first time, I knew I never had to. Their world had crumbled. Mine had just begun. In the months that followed their collapse, my life took on a stillness I hadn't known was possible. It wasn't the kind of stillness born from absence or loneliness. It was the profound, peaceful quiet that comes after a storm has finally broken and moved on. The air felt cleaner. The weight pressing down on my chest for years had lifted, and for the first time, every breath I took was truly my own. I moved to a different side of the city, far from the neighborhood where every street corner whispered old memories. My new apartment was small but bright, the walls painted a warm cream color that caught the morning sun and made everything seem just a little more alive. I filled the space with plants, soft rugs, shelves stacked high with books I hadn't had time to read before, and photographs from places I dreamed of visiting. My home was no longer a pit stop between family crises. It was mine, a true sanctuary. What fried too. Without the constant emotional drain of being everyone's safety net, my energy and focus sharpened. I earned a promotion, then another, my name appearing more often in internal newsletters and project briefings. People looked at me differently, not as a fixer or a giver, but as someone competent, strong, and reliable in a way that had nothing to do with bending over backward for others. On weekends, I would take long walks with Max, my rescue dog who had, in many ways, rescued me right back. We explored new parks, new neighborhoods, new parts of life I hadn't had time for when I was drowning in someone else's emergencies. I learned to cook dishes that once seemed too complicated. I took art classes, where my hands remembered the joy of creating for no one but myself. I even went on my first vacation in years, standing barefoot on a beach I'd only ever seen in magazines, the waves lapping at my ankles, the horizon stretching endlessly before me. It was there, watching the sun sink below the water in a blaze of orange and gold, that I realized something so simple it nearly knocked the air from my lungs. I had survived them. And not just survived, I had built something better in their absence. They had wanted my money. They had wanted my loyalty, my obedience, my silence, my endless willingness to bleed for them. But in the end, what they lost was far greater than the dollars they could no longer demand. They lost me. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with a kind of bittersweet sadness, the kind you feel when you finally walk away from a place you once loved but know you can never return to. The final confirmation of how much things had changed came one crisp autumn afternoon. I was sitting at a local cafe, writing in a journal, a habit I had picked up to process the swirling emotions of the past year, when my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Lily. It had been almost a year since we had spoken. "Hey Emma," the message began. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me. I just wanted to say, I get it now. I really do. I'm sorry for everything. I hope you're happy." I stared at the screen for a long time, the words blurring slightly. A year ago, I would have agonized over how to respond. Would a reply open old wounds? Would silence make me cruel? Would forgiveness make me weak? But now, the answer came easily. I didn't owe her anything. Not my anger. Not my forgiveness. Not my time. Closure wasn't something she could give me. It was something I had already found within myself. I placed the phone face down on the table and finished my journal entry without replying. Some wounds aren't meant to be reopened. A few weeks later, just before Thanksgiving, I received an invitation in the mail. It was handwritten in Lily's neat cursive, a small gathering, a family dinner, meant to mend fences and start over. I didn't even consider going. The dinner would be a performance, a last-ditch attempt to pull me back into a role I had long since abandoned. They weren't offering real change. They were offering another chance for me to become useful again. And I was done being useful at the expense of myself. Thanksgiving came and went quietly. I spent it with friends I had made at my art class, sitting around a mismatched table full of homemade dishes, laughter, and warmth. There was no tension, no hidden strings attached to every gesture of kindness. Just genuine, uncomplicated care. That night, as I washed dishes and listened to music humming softly in the background, I realized that family wasn't about blood. It wasn't about obligation. It was about the people who chose you and whom you chose back, without expectation or demand. The people who celebrated your no's as much as your yes. Winter arrived, painting the city in shades of white and silver. I found myself smiling more often, laughing without that tight knot of anxiety in my chest. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, fully and completely. Sometimes, on particularly clear nights, when the world outside my window looked clean and new under a dusting of snow, I would think about the life I had left behind. I would wonder if they still talked about me in hushed, bitter tones. If they still told themselves stories that painted me as a villain. But those thoughts no longer carried any sting. Their opinions, their narratives, they no longer had any weight in the life I was building. The real power wasn't in proving them wrong. It was in knowing that their approval was no longer the currency I lived by. And that was the greatest freedom of all. The final, true ending to my story with them came not with a confrontation, not with a grand speech or a climactic showdown, but with a simple, quiet decision. I chose to move forward, not fueled by anger, not chained by guilt, not dragged down by the past. Just moving freely toward the life I had always deserved. One morning, as the first hints of spring thawed the city streets, I stood on my balcony sipping coffee, Max curled up by my feet. The sun rose over the skyline, casting everything in a soft, hopeful light. I pulled out my phone and opened a new note. At the top, I typed 3 simple sentences. They wanted my money. They lost me instead. And I have never been more whole. I set the phone down and closed my eyes, letting the sun warm my face. I was not heartless. I was not cruel. I was finally, fiercely, beautifully free. And no one could ever take that away from me again. One of the most profound lessons life teaches us is that survival often requires choosing ourselves, even when the people we love most make us feel guilty for doing so. For years, I believed that loyalty meant sacrifice without limit, that love was proven through endurance, that being a good daughter, sister, or family member meant carrying the weight of everyone's mistakes without complaint. But the truth is far different, and infinitely more liberating. True love does not demand self-destruction. True loyalty does not ask you to erase yourself to satisfy the needs of others. Through my journey, I learned that boundaries are not barriers to love. They are the framework that allows healthy relationships to thrive. Without them, love curdles into obligation, into resentment, into something brittle and broken. It is not cruel to say no when saying yes would hollow you out. It is not selfish to protect your peace, your stability, and your future from those who would drain you dry in the name of family or tradition. Sometimes, the people closest to us are the ones who teach us the most painful lessons. They show us that unconditional love cannot be one-sided. They reveal, through their actions, that being needed is not the same as being valued. They force us to confront the reality that blood ties do not guarantee respect, kindness, or empathy. And when they refuse to change, refuse to see you as anything more than a means to an end, survival demands that you walk away. Walking away is not easy. It is not glamorous. It is a quiet, aching process filled with second-guessing, sleepless nights, and moments of crushing doubt. You will grieve, not just the loss of people, but the loss of the dreams you had for those relationships, the fantasy that one day they would become what you needed them to be. You will mourn the version of yourself who kept trying, who kept hoping, who believed that if you just gave a little more, loved a little harder, everything would finally be okay. But in that mourning, you will find rebirth. You will discover the parts of yourself that were buried under years of guilt and fear. You will reclaim the dreams you once set aside. You will realize that love given freely, without expectation or coercion, is the only kind worth building a life around. Another crucial lesson is that survival is not just about escape, it is about creation. It's not enough to walk away from toxicity. You must also walk towards something better. You must build a life that reflects your worth, your passions, your joy. You must fill the empty spaces left behind not with bitterness, but with hope and purpose. You must teach yourself that you deserve laughter without anxiety, rest without guilt, love without conditions. Forgiveness, too, becomes a different concept. It is no longer about absolving those who hurt you for their sake. It is about releasing yourself from the chains of anger and resentment. It is about acknowledging the hurt, learning from it, and then choosing to no longer carry it forward into your future. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, not to excuse what was done, but to refuse to let it define you. There will be moments when the world tries to pull you back into old roles, old expectations. There will be people who do not understand your choices, who judge you through the lens of their own fear and biases. You must remember that their misunderstanding is not your failure. Your worth is not up for debate. Your peace is not negotiable. Choosing yourself, especially when you have been conditioned to believe that everyone else's needs should come first, is an act of immense courage. It is a rebellion against every voice that told you your value was measured in sacrifice. It is a declaration that you are not a resource to be exploited, but a human being deserving of respect, care, and dignity. The people who truly love you will not punish you for setting boundaries. They will not make you feel guilty for taking care of yourself. They will celebrate your growth, even if it means they no longer occupy the same place in your life. Real love adapts. Real love respects. As you move forward, you will learn to build new families. Families made of friends who show up not because they need something from you, but because they genuinely care. You will create communities where your no is heard with as much grace as your yes. You will experience relationships that are rooted in mutual support, where love does not come with a ledger of debts owed. You will become the architect of your own peace. And peace, once earned, is a treasure beyond measure. Perhaps the most beautiful lesson is this: survival does not have to look like mere existence. It can be vibrant, joyful, expansive. It can be art and laughter and quiet mornings where you sip your coffee without dread gnawing at the edges of your mind. It can be messy, imperfect, full of mistakes and missteps, and still be infinitely better than the life you left behind. In choosing yourself, you do not become heartless. You do not become selfish. You become whole. You realize that you were never asking for too much. You were simply asking the wrong people. And in that realization, you find freedom. Not the freedom of running away, but the freedom of standing firm in who you are, unashamed and unapologetic. The freedom of knowing that you deserve a life filled with people who love you not for what you can give them, but simply because you are you. You learn to trust yourself again. To listen to that quiet inner voice that says, "This is not right," and believe it without needing permission or validation. You learn that survival is not the end of the story. It's the beginning. It's the foundation on which you will build a life so rich, so full, so unapologetically yours, that the shadows of the past will no longer dim its brightness. And when you look back, not with bitterness, but with clarity, you will see that choosing yourself was not a betrayal. It was the purest, bravest act of love you could ever offer. First to yourself, and then to the life you are finally free to live.